Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you here this morning to outline the Territorial Cohesion Programme ESPON and the new ESPON 2030 programme. As Rose mentioned, my name is Caroline Creamer and I'm the ESPON contact point for Ireland. As you'll see from the next slide, since its creation in 2002, the ESPON programme has been contributing to policy making by analysing territorial trends and producing data and knowledge to the benefit of policymakers all over Europe and at all levels. We're now moving into the fourth generation of ESPON, each building on its predecessor and each representing innovations in design, delivery and outreach, and a deepening of supports to policymakers in terms of evidence, data, knowledge development and advice. Next slide, please. ESPON, funded through the ERDF, covers all 27 member states and the 4 partner states. Under ESPON 2030, it will have an expected budget of 58 million. From the beginning, the ESPON programme has been organising and financing applied research, place-based and policy analysis, pan-European comparative analysis and data collection to support the formulation of territorial development policies in Europe. It aims to assist regions, cities and national governments, and indeed regional and local governments, to improve the quality of their decision making on identified territorial challenges by supporting the development, implementation and monitoring of policies and strategies. So in this context, the ESPON programme is primarily targeted to the 3 following groups, which can be all active at different stages in the policy cycle. So we have our policy makers, and I suppose in some sense that's in the narrowest of senses, being our politicians and our decision makers. Then also policy enablers, and in this sense we're talking about our public sector bodies, our policy officers, our thematic experts in terms of public administration and other types of public organisations in the field of territorial development. And then we have our research community through our higher education institutes, further education, training bodies, etc. Just to note that in Ireland, the ESPON programme is supported by the responsible ministry, which is the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, the Southern Regional Assembly, who represents Ireland on the ESPON Managing Committee, and then Maynooth University, who currently holds the ESPON contact point for Ireland. Next slide, please. So what does ESPON do, and how does it do it, and how does it work? Well, straight off, it is important to say up front that ESPON is not a capital spend programme. It is primarily a research programme with research tailored to policy needs and processes. There are 2 main types of research programmes, both with an emphasis on evidence production. The first is applied research, and this is focused on analysing territorial trends across Europe at a pan-European level, looking at challenges or issues such as low carbon economies, circular economy, green infrastructure, changing demography, poverty, accessibility, etc. It's quite a broad list of areas that ESPON covers. To give some examples of research that has taken place in Ireland under the Applied Research banner, we had the Compass project, which looked at spatial planning systems across all member states, and this programme involved UCD and did look at the Irish spatial planning system and how it compared and contrasted to its European counterparts. We had the Greta programme focused on green infrastructure, and which included a case study on Dún Laoghaire. And we have the Escape project looking at rural shrinkage and our future of our rural areas and those undergoing depopulation, which involved Teagasc. And the next slide, we'll talk through the targeted analysis, which is another type of research programme undertaken by ESPON, but these are bottom-up and stakeholder-driven project with an emphasis on considering shared challenges through knowledge transfer. So very much similar to URBACT, it's very much driven by stakeholders identifying the challenges, and in response, ESPON pulling together a consortium of researchers to look at solutions to those challenges. Looking at some examples from Ireland, the Ensure project looked at second city port regeneration and involved UCD, Trinity College and Cork City Council. The Lakes project has a case study on Lough Neagh, while the QGAS project is led by the Eastern and Midlands Regional Assembly as the lead stakeholder, and also representatives from the Scottish and Northern Irish government. And in addition then to evidence production, another core objective of ESPON is knowledge transfer. And this is done through a dedicated programme of transnational outreach. This is aimed at boosting the awareness and use of European territorial evidence through events, production of publications, policy briefings, etc. By way of just some examples of events and publications generated in Ireland in recent times, in April 2021, Ireland hosted a transnational ESPON peer learning workshop on greening tourism and reimagining the tourism sector in Ireland, all the information of which is on the ESPON website, including a recording of the event. And in 2020, a consortium of Irish researchers produced a topic paper on how marine spatial planning can support the resilience of European land-sea interactions, very timely in terms of the growing emphasis on marine spatial planning and land-sea interactions. Next slide, please. So having given you a flavour of what ESPON does and where it can come into its own in terms of supporting policymakers and practitioners in evidence production and knowledge development through sharing of experiences, the new ESPON programme, ESPON 2030, has a very clear mission statement, that being in support of public stakeholders seeking to find appropriate and coordinated policy responses across sectors and governmental levels to the advantage of European citizens, the ESPON programme shall focus on the two key topics that gather most of the issues and challenges to cohesion and the harmonious development of our European territories. Those being green transition to climate neutral economies and just living conditions for all peoples and places. So ESPON recognises that the green transition will be one of the dominant policy issues for Europe for the coming years. At the same time, there is a big debate about living conditions across Europe and indeed the world, recognising that disparities are becoming more pronounced between regions, municipalities and neighbourhoods, and that a concentration of socioeconomic and environmental challenges can spill over into governance-related challenges. The imperative of the ESPON 2030 therefore remains to support informed policymaking and to bridge the gap between evidence, knowledge and policymaking. In both its evidence production and knowledge development, ESPON 2030 advocates for a move away from administrative borders in favour of addressing challenges on a functional area basis, and very much adopting a place-based approach, recognising the uniqueness and asset base of each and every place. Next slide, please. This was in terms of a policy context for ESPON 2030. It is centred on 5 key territorial challenges. The first being environmental changes, and this includes such things as climate change, depletion of resources, biodiversity loss. We have social diversities, looking at ageing, depopulation, economic transitions with a focus on smart specialisation and innovation, technological transformations, looking at digitalisation, automation, robotics, etc., and multi-level governance, considering the deepening complexities in decision making and the new emphasis on functional territories. These key territorial challenges are all relevant to improving policy making. And policy making means ESPON providing the evidence, the data analysis in support of cohesion policy objectives, the EU sectoral policies, the Territorial Agenda 2030, the EU Green Deal, just transition programmes, and indeed national, regional and local policies. So as we've heard of the other programmes, it very much is about embedding future ESPON research in strategic policy frameworks. And as EU cohesion policy is shifting towards taking a more thematic approach to delivery of its programme priorities, this in turn is informing new innovations in the design of ESPON 2030. And as we'll see from the next slide, the types of innovations that ESPON are implementing in the new programming period, well, one of the key innovations is to take a more strategic approach to investigating territorial challenges through what they call thematic action plans, or TAPs. And these are closely related to stakeholders and their needs. The TAPs will be supported by cross-cutting horizontal measures that will increase the value added of ESPON's work. For example, through case studies and territorial foresight exercises, bringing together evidence from a number of TAPs and publications to support the Pacific policy needs. As we'll see from the next slide, the TAPs are strategic programming documents for a Pacific theme, yet the themes are all interrelated. So these TAPs do not stand in isolation of each other, and it's very important to note that. And within these TAPs, they will define the work packages of evidence production and knowledge development activities, which address a range of needs as identified in an earlier open consultation across member states that was held in 2020, and which can support different stages of policy development. So it is envisaged that the TAPs will detail Pacific territorial trends and drivers that policymaking will have to address in a Pacific thematic field. It will outline the available territorial evidence that exists and upon which future ESPON activities could build. It will highlight where the evidence gaps are that ESPON activities are most appropriate to fill. It will highlight the knowledge gaps among policymakers at all levels that prevent them from delivering effective policy responses. And it will outline some of the major thematic activities to be pursued that will bring the evidence to the policymakers and transfer it into actionable knowledge. Next slide, please. So I suppose in summary, what the TAPs will do is that on the one side, they will outline the activities related to the production of evidence. They will highlight European-wide projects, targeted analysis, case studies, data maps. While on the other end of the spectrum, they will also feed into knowledge development and indicate how that knowledge should be transferred and shared across member states and across different types of sectoral organisation. All the while, these activities being guided by the needs of the stakeholders and based on a sound research approach with a focus on gaps in existing knowledge and innovative approaches. So ESPON 2030 will not fund work that has already taken place. And as with many of the other projects, again, it's recommended that you go and have a look at the ESPON website, which is quite a detailed listing of all the projects since back to 2002 that have been funded by ESPON. And you'll be able to see the trends of where projects have built on each other, and also then through the TAPs identify where gaps still exist and where ESPON are very keen to see new research emerge. So on the next slide, we'll see that to date, 4 TAPs have been identified, 4 thematic areas of action planned for the new programming period. The 4 TAPs are climate neutral territories, perspectives for all people and places, places resilient to crisis, and governance of new geographies. And indeed, over the programming period, it is envisaged that further TAPs will be added to these 4. Next slide, please. So while there is agreement on the principal themes of the first 4 TAPs to be addressed by the ESPON 2030 programme, in a new, innovative way, every TAP is now going through a public consultation process to ensure that they do meet stakeholders' needs and target the right groupings of policymakers and researchers alike. An open consultation process commenced in November and closed at the end of January. And following that open consultation, we're now moving into and have moved into a round of focus groups to further elaborate and refine the focus of the TAP programs and what the future research basis will be. Next slide, please. So with that initial consultation now closed, next steps are very much dependent on the approval process of the ESPON 2030 programme. We're not quite across the line yet, but we're very nearly there. And so all going to plan, it is envisaged that in the second trimester of this year, the TAPs will be finalised and submitted for approval. And that also in the second trimester, most likely in July, that there will be a launch of activities under each TAP, and we will have our first calls for research programmes. So as we consider perspectives for all people and places, climate neutral territories, places resilient to crisis, and governance of new geographies, in the context of the 5 key territorial challenges of environmental change, social diversity, economic transition, technological transformation, and multi-level governance, and recognising the critical role of evidence production and knowledge sharing and development in effective policy making, then please do consider ESPON 2030 as a mechanism to support you in both achieving and strengthening territorial cohesion.